tonight with what you could call the ridiculous, obscuring, and extreme Trump power grab, which may fail in the courts. You know, there's a lot of news this week that could be from The Onion. Denmark punking Trump over his musings about buying Greenland, which wasn't even for sale. Trump now canceling a visit to the U.S. ally. The ongoing feud with a former top aide right out of a reality show plotline. And, of course, the story that has everyone asking to define the word star. Sean Spicer seeking celebrity redemption on a dance show. These are spicy stories. Some are purely madcap, like Spicer. Some are spats that reveal something larger, as U.S. foreign policy can turn on Trump's frenemy issues. But our top story tonight is about the Trump administration's actions that are, as a matter of facts and history, reaching extreme degrees. So if you haven't heard much about this top story tonight, note that Donald Trump isn't tweeting much about it. It doesn't involve trolling or reality shows. It is about a president seizing new powers to detain people indefinitely. Let me repeat, indefinite detention. That sounds ominous because it is. The U.S. Constitution, most democracies severely limit the government's power to detain people. People, not just adults, not just citizens, not just legal residents, but all people, because protections for human rights apply to all humans. Keep that in mind as you take in the Trump administration's new federal rule seizing detention powers and attempting to abolish the current court-approved limit on how long migrant families are detained. Trump pushing to end the 20-day limit and claim the power to hold them for as long as it takes for their cases to get decided. Some officials say that could be months, but there's no formal limit. No limit means no limit. Indefinite. Some people could still be released before 20 days are up, sure. Others might not be released for months or years. Trump's own officials are struggling to defend this today.
So there is no such thing as indefinite detention.
What would the maximum be?
There is no maximum. The maximum amount of time is what's required to complete the case. But I should also note that these individuals, while they're going, Brandon, let me.
There's no maximum equals indefinitely.
No, it's not.
That's a huge deal. It has been in the works, but the formal rule is now being released in these waning days of summer after months of immigration controversies. So what do you need to know? First, this is an attempted power grab, but Trump doesn't get the last word because this would change a court agreement that presidents in both parties have followed. A federal judge must still approve this plan. The agreement it would alter is from a court settlement known as the Flores Agreement. And why is there that agreement? Well, here's the part of the story that goes well beyond Trump. It predates him. Many presidents in both parties have been reined in by the courts over mistreating migrants and trying to lean towards indefinite detention when it happens. In fact, back in the 1980s, migrant kids fleeing violence in El Salvador were kept in atrocious conditions, held behind a barricade of razor wire surrounding an old motel in Pasadena. Migrants were locked in overcrowded rooms, children and adults jammed in together. The New York Times reporting those kids didn't get any school, recreation, doctors, or visits with relatives, and they endured body cavity searches. It took migrant advocates going to court and judges rebuking the administration to stop that problem. And now to give you the context, we dug up how that lawsuit from that court battle was reported at the time.
14-year-old Alma Yanira Cruz has been held in this Pasadena detention center for a month and a half since she was caught trying to enter the country. Under Immigration and Naturalization Service policy, she can be released only to a parent.
Yo me llamo Ana.
But her mother is afraid to pick her up for fear they will both be deported. Lawyers from the Centers for Youth Law and Immigrants' Rights charge the children are being used as bait to catch the parents. They filed a lawsuit challenging the policy and the conditions under which youngsters are held.
That was a huge deal. They won a part of that battle, setting these rules, which were ultimately finalized by courts in the Clinton administration. Those rules are part of the framework for most of these battles today, from Obama's handling of a Central American migrant surge to Donald Trump's crackdowns. Now, Trump officials say they had to split up families partly as a way to combat these very rules. They claim that doing that was so they wouldn't be accused of holding kids past the 20-day mark. And now, at a time when Stephen Miller's consolidated more power over the entire immigration system, we see this wholesale attack on these human rights rules. Now, judges could reject this, just like they recently rejected the Trump administration's attack on rules to provide toothpaste and soap to detained kids. But let's look at this all together. As a matter of ethics, I want you to know these rules set a minimum threshold for human rights and human dignity. As a matter of ideology, honest conservatives and civil libertarians support these protections, both as human rights and as a limit on government power. You remember all the arguments about stemming the federal government's power? Well, some of that looks empty as a Republican president tries to seize these new powers of indefinite detention. And one more thing. If this term rings a vague bell, if it sounds concerning, recall the last time the Supreme Court limited the government's power to hold foreigners in indefinite detention. It was in a case where the arguments for it are the strongest possible, indefinitely holding suspected terrorists and enemy combatants at Guantanamo Bay. Now, there were some strong security arguments there. Some of those people look terrible. But that didn't mean a president could overrule Congress and the courts to claim those unilateral detention powers, even regarding foreigners, even regarding suspected terrorists. Some of those claims to indefinite detention without trial were rejected by a conservative-leaning Supreme Court and ruled unconstitutional. This history is the context for this power grab today that Donald Trump's not tweeting about. It's the context from Flores to Gitmo to Stephen Miller. And this is a time to keep your eye on the ball. I'm joined now by Jason Johnson from The Root, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto from the University of Texas, and Paulo Ramos, a former campaign aide to Hillary Clinton and now host of Vice's Latin X. Your thoughts?
So I think you framed it perfectly. I think this goes way beyond immigration policy. This goes way beyond any sort of deterrence tactics. This is them very deliberately, very strategically trying to reframe and rewrite who in this country is entitled to basic human rights. I mean, that is a big deal. So my question always is, instead of brown kids in these detention centers, instead of them, if we had American kids, if we had white kids, European kids, would they be pushing for this so hard? Right? Because knowing what we know, right, we know that they don't have toothpaste in there. We know that there are kids sleeping in cages. We know that 7 children died under their watch. We know that they don't have access to vaccines, to basic shots. Knowing all of this, again, why? Why are they doing this?
Right. And why right now?
And why right now? And I go back to one thing that I heard this week repeatedly, which is as Donald Trump was pushing this anti-abortion effort, right, he was using these words. He kept saying, every child is a gift of God. He said those words. Every child is a sacred gift of God. Are those children also? Does he view them the same way?
I think that's very important because we're now in the space we're talking about what the government can do to whom and to human beings. And you're talking about the value of life in that language. Children. Jason, viewers know you're not a big fan of the president. I think it's important that we look at this story tonight much broader than Trump, which is why we reported it out with some of that context. Regardless of your views of the president, what do you think and would you support indefinite detention powers for any president?
No, Ari, and the really dangerous part about this is, you know, in the military they call it mission creep, but the same thing can happen with policy. If you basically say, I can separate children from their parents until some legal issue is determined, right? At this point, they're just saying, well, until someone's immigration status is determined. Well, what happens in the instances where information in order to determine a child's immigration status is based on information they would have to get from their parents? There are 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds. They don't know what their address is. They don't know the entire circumstances. They were brought here by a parent who was fleeing violence or danger or some other issue one way or another. It is an excuse to basically hold people indefinitely. And if that can be done to people who are legally seeking the right to come to this country and seek refuge, that same sort of policy could eventually be used on American citizens. And I think this is really key, and one of the reasons that this is a very good import. No matter how many times we say that this is a terrible administration, and I love my country more than any particular presidency, the greatest fear that we have to have is any administration using a power that can subsequently be used by someone worse down the road. And as bad as we think Donald Trump is, imagine this sort of behavior, imagine this sort of policy in the hands of a president who is actually slightly more sophisticated. They could use it for all sorts of excuses, all sorts of terrorism. Gang members could be defined as terrorists and held indefinitely. That is the danger of these kinds of policies at the border, what they could become down the road.
Victoria, here was the president on this.
One of the things that's happening when they see you can't get into the United States, or when they see if they do get in the United States, they will be brought back to their country. It won't matter if they get in or not, because we're doing that. They won't come.
There's a lot in there, including a theory about how information will travel back and whether indefinite detention notwithstanding what I just laid out as what's wrong with it, will still be considered worse than what people may be fleeing.
Right.
So the Trump administration, Stephen Miller in particular, has argued that having families, family protections for children, basically the Flores settlement, is an incentive for folks from Central America to come. It's their get out of free jail card. But the truth of the matter is that these people are coming here because they are fleeing violence. These Central American countries in the Northern Triangle are the ones with some of the highest homicide rates. The other piece to this, Ari, is that we also see some of the highest femicide rates. The massive gang culture that has taken place in El Salvador and some of these other countries are targeting women in particular. And you're not going to leave your child. You are fleeing for your life, and you're not just going to leave your kid there and say, well, I'm going to go over here to safety. That's why we have the family units coming over. It's not an incentive. So instead of attacking the victims of this violence, why don't we give economic aid, help with the economic development of these places? Ari, it costs $3.5 million a day to fund detention centers here in the United States. If we took that money and used it for economic development, we would not be in the mess and the humanitarian crisis that we are right now.
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned some of the history, that this agreement was struck under the Clinton administration to rein them in, that the Obama administration had high deportation rates and also struggled with the Flores agreement, Jason, is to make sure people understand that while there are ways that Trump, according to the evidence and the facts which we've shown, is far more harsh and has more human rights abuses, the system here is about whether the executive in our American system will actually be held accountable or not. And that's why when you hear indefinite detention, you got to perk up. And it happens that there's a Republican administration right now, and it happens that they're more extreme according to the rulings and the evidence we've got. But as we've been discussing, it's broader than that. Now, here are some of the Democrats in Congress today speaking out where it does get back to the political side of it, not just the structural. Take a look.
That's actually what the administration proposes to do today, to detain these frightened families who are at wit's end, who are at their most desperate and vulnerable indefinitely going forward. This cannot be allowed to stand.
This is another example of this administration's cruelty.
Everything about immigration he's done to try to scare people.
Jason, some of those former members of Congress, many of them recognizable as aspirants for the White House. But when you look at that, what do you see as important here? Because when the Democrats come in at this at the micro level, right, which is individual cases, their stories, they're powerful, and we've certainly covered that. But it seems that today is a marker where we're at the macro level. Stephen Miller was not kidding when he came out and said the president's powers shall not be questioned.
Right. And that's the thing, Ari. This goes back, you don't even have to go to Steve Miller. This goes back to Steve Bannon and Bannon's theory that the best way to sort of overtake this country was to tear down the state, to make the state so dysfunctional that you will lead to circumstances where people will leave, self-deport, and that allows some of these right-wing forces to go forward. You know, to be perfectly honest, if this administration had not pulled so much funding away from immigration courts, this may not be as much of a problem. The issue is you have pulled funding away from immigration courts. People's cases are sitting there and stacking up, and they're trapped here for months and months and months, and now you're saying you can hold them forever. This is a solution to a problem that this administration created so that they can continue with their white nationalist policies. That is the structural danger here, that the Trump administration consistently creates problems, they create family separation, and use that to push through these kinds of dangers. That is what I think many candidates should be paying attention to, because the political thing is fine, but the structural mess will have to be solved by one of these people if they somehow end up being president next year.
And I think he said it perfectly fine. They will not be able to solve this problem. They don't even know what this means logistically. They have no idea. What we do know is that this is part of their white supremacist manifesto. It reads like it, it feels like it, and it is what is happening in front of our eyes every single day.
Paulo Ramos, very well put. Victoria DeFrancesco and Jason Johnson, thanks to each of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.